Before we begin, I want to ask you something, and I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance without knowing their story? I'll be honest, I used to walk past homeless people thinking they chose that life. I was wrong about everything. Stay with me through this story, and I promise it will change how you see people forever. Also, if this story touches your heart, and I believe it will, please hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. Stories like Marcus's need to be heard, and your subscription helps us share more real-life transformations that will restore your faith in humanity. Comment below if you've ever lost everything you thought was secure. What I'm about to tell you will shock you. It happened to me, and it could happen to anyone. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. 3 years ago, I wasn't the man you're about to meet. 3 years ago, I had a corner office on the 32nd floor of the Millennium Tower in downtown Chicago. I had a drafting table by the window where I could watch the city change seasons while I designed buildings that would outlast me. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park with hardwood floors and a kitchen I actually cooked in. I had a 401k, health insurance, and a 5-year plan that seemed as solid as the steel beams in my architectural drawings. But life has a way of taking a wrecking ball to your blueprints. The recession hit the construction industry like a plague. First, they canceled the new projects. Then they put the existing ones on hold. By the time the layoffs started, I'd already seen half my colleagues pack up their drafting tables and disappear into unemployment lines. I lasted longer than most. Senior architects were harder to replace. But when the firm lost the Morrison Hotel renovation contract, they had to make deeper cuts. "It's nothing personal, Marcus," my boss had said, sliding a severance package across his mahogany desk. "You're talented, dedicated. In better times, you'd be running this place. But these aren't better times. 6 weeks of severance pay, health insurance through the end of the month, a recommendation letter and a handshake. 22 years of work reduced to a cardboard box of personal items and a security escort to the elevator. I thought it would be temporary. I thought my experience, my portfolio, my connections would open doors. But the whole industry was bleeding. Every firm was cutting staff, not hiring. My savings lasted 4 months. My unemployment benefits lasted 8 more. The apartment went first. I couldn't make rent on what the state was paying me. Then the car, repossessed while I was in a job interview at a firm that ultimately hired someone willing to work for half what I used to make. By the time winter arrived, I was sleeping in my cousin's basement in Pilsen, listening to her husband complain about freeloaders every morning over coffee I couldn't afford to replace. The breaking point came on a December night when their 8-year-old daughter asked her mother why Uncle Marcus smelled funny and never wore clean clothes. I left the next morning with everything I owned in a duffel bag and $43 in my wallet. Pause this video and tell me in the comments, what would you do with only $43 to your name and nowhere to go? Most people think they'd figure it out, but the reality is terrifying. Keep watching to see how quickly everything can fall apart. The first night on the street, I told myself it was temporary. I'd find a shelter, get back on my feet, find work. But Chicago's shelters were overcrowded and dangerous, with waiting lists longer than the winter nights. The Salvation Army had bed space for maybe half the people who needed it. The city-run facilities were little better than prisons, where your belongings would be stolen before you fell asleep and your safety depended on staying invisible. So I found doorways, loading docks, 24-hour laundromats where I could sit with a cup of coffee for hours before someone asked me to leave. And eventually, I found the stone steps of St. Mary's Cathedral. The cathedral was built in 1885, back when Chicago was rebuilding itself after the Great Fire. Gothic Revival architecture with limestone walls thick enough to block the wind and arched doorways that provided some shelter from the snow. The building itself was beautiful, the kind of structure I would have studied and admired in my old life, analyzing the flying buttresses and rose windows like a love letter written in stone. But now, it was just somewhere to sleep. I'd been there about 2 weeks when the morning came that changed everything. November in Chicago is a cruel month when winter announces its intentions but hasn't yet delivered its worst punishment. The temperature was hovering just above freezing, cold enough to seep through my inadequate jacket, but not cold enough to numb the deeper pain that had settled into my bones. I was sketching that morning because sketching was the only thing I had left that connected me to who I used to be. The sketchbook was a birthday gift from my ex-girlfriend, Sarah. We'd broken up 6 months before the layoffs, when she said I was becoming distant and obsessed with work. The irony wasn't lost on me now. The book had survived everything. the eviction, the nights in shelters, the weeks of rain that had soaked through everything else I owned. Its pages were yellowed and water-stained, the cover held together with electrical tape I'd found in an alley, but it was mine. It was proof that I had once created things, that my hands were capable of more than just begging for change. I was drawing the cathedral's western facade, trying to capture the way the morning light played across the carved saints above the entrance, when I noticed someone approaching. My peripheral vision had become sharper during my weeks on the street. You learn to track movement, to assess threats, to make yourself small when necessary. She was in her 50s, wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the wind, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never wondered where her next meal would come from. She was walking with purpose, but I could see her pace slow as she noticed me sitting there. This was the moment of decision that happened a dozen times a day. Some people sped up, avoiding eye contact. Others fumbled for change, dropping it into whatever container I had, without really looking at me. A few stopped to talk, usually to deliver lectures about personal responsibility or the availability of social services they assumed I was too lazy or addicted to access. But something about her demeanor was different. She wasn't reaching for her purse or preparing to hurry past. She was looking directly at me, and what I saw in her face made my stomach tighten with familiar dread. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold and from hours of not speaking. "I'm not asking for money. If you might have any food you could spare. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." It was true. The soup kitchen at St. Vincent's had been closed for health department violations, and the sandwich I'd bought with my last $3 had been my only meal in 36 hours. My stomach felt hollow, cramping with hunger that went beyond simple appetite. She stopped walking, turned to face me fully, and that's when I saw it. Not just irritation or indifference, but something darker, something that looked almost like hatred. "Don't talk to me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "People like you chose this life. You chose whatever brought you here, the drugs, the alcohol, the gambling, whatever weakness you couldn't overcome. Don't expect the rest of us to clean up your mess." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my face flush despite the cold, felt something hot and defensive rise in my throat. "Ma'am, I don't drink. I don't use drugs. I lost my job. I lost my apartment, but I never chose." "Save it for someone gullible enough to believe you," she cut me off, her voice rising. "I've heard every sob story, every excuse. You people are all the same. You think the world owes you something because you made bad choices." Other pedestrians were starting to notice the confrontation. I could see them slowing down, some pulling out phones. The humiliation was almost worse than the hunger, the cold, the sleepless nights. To be dressed down like a child in public, to have my humanity questioned by someone who knew nothing about me or my story. "I worked for 22 years, I said quietly, trying to maintain some dignity. "I was an architect. I designed buildings you probably walk through every day. I paid taxes, I volunteered. I never asked anyone for anything until—" "An architect?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, and I'm sure you were a doctor or a lawyer or whatever story you think will get you sympathy. You're sitting outside a church with your hand out like a common beggar, and you want me to believe you're some fallen professional?" She looked at the cathedral behind me, at the stone cross carved above the massive oak doors, and her expression shifted into something even crueler. Religious certainty mixed with self-righteousness. "You know what?" she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering divine judgment. "Jesus wouldn't save you. You're sitting outside his house, begging like a common criminal, but you're too far gone for salvation. Some people are just beyond help, and you're one of them. God helps those who help themselves, and clearly you've chosen not to. Then I need you to pause right here and comment. Have you ever been told you were worthless? Have you ever told someone else they were worthless?" This woman's words nearly destroyed me, but what happened next will amaze you. If you're feeling this story in your heart, smash that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this ends. She paused, letting the words sink in, making sure I understood the full weight of her condemnation. "The Bible says the poor will always be with us, but it doesn't say we have to enable them. You want help? Get cleaned up. Get a job. Stop expecting handouts from people who actually work for a living. Until then, don't pollute this sacred space with your presence." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with finality. I sat there watching her disappear into the crowd of morning commuters, people with jobs to go to and lives to live, people who belonged to the world I had fallen out of. The words echoed in my head. "Jesus wouldn't save you. You're too far gone for salvation. Some people are just beyond help." I looked down at my hands, at the pencil I was still holding, at the half-finished sketch of the cathedral's facade. My hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. For weeks I'd been telling myself that this was temporary, that I was still the same person I'd always been, just going through a rough patch. But hearing those words spoken with such conviction, such certainty, by someone standing outside a church dedicated to compassion and mercy, it broke something inside me that I didn't know was still intact. I closed the sketchbook and pressed it against my chest, as if it could protect me from the weight of her judgment. Around me, the city continued its morning routine. Cars honked in traffic. People rushed past with coffee cups and briefcases. The cathedral bells chimed 9 o'clock, marking time in a world that had moved on without me. You're too far gone for salvation. I spent the rest of that day walking the streets, those words playing on repeat in my mind like a broken record. I found myself looking at my reflection in store windows, trying to see what she had seen. The hollow cheeks, the stubble, the clothes that hadn't been properly washed in weeks, the hollow eyes of someone who had given up hoping for tomorrow. By evening, when I returned to the cathedral steps, I wasn't the same person who had woken up there that morning. Something fundamental had shifted. The woman's words had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't shake, a question that would haunt me. If someone who claimed to follow Christ could look at me with such disgust, such certainty about my worthlessness, what did that say about my value as a human being? I opened my sketchbook that night under the orange glow of a streetlight, my fingers numb with cold, but steady enough to draw. Instead of architecture or landscapes, I started drawing faces. The woman's face first, every line of disgust and self-righteousness I could remember. Then the faces of all the people who had walked past me that day without seeing me. Businessmen checking their phones, mothers pulling their children closer, teenagers who looked right through me as if I were invisible. And finally, I drew my own face as I'd seen it reflected in those store windows, hollow-eyed, desperate, disappearing piece by piece. As I drew, tears fell onto the paper, smudging the graphite lines. I didn't try to stop them. For the first time in months, I was feeling something other than numbness, and even pain was better than the emptiness that had been consuming me. The cathedral bells chimed midnight, and I realized I'd been drawing for 3 hours. My fingers were too cold to feel the pencil anymore, but I'd filled 6 pages with portraits of indifference, cruelty, and despair. It was the most honest work I'd done since losing my job, maybe since losing my hope. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of a journey that would take me deeper into darkness before it led me toward any kind of light. The woman's words had found their target, embedding themselves in my psyche like shrapnel. Now I had to learn to live with them, to carry their weight without letting them crush what remained of my spirit. But first, I had to fall much further than I already had, because sometimes salvation doesn't look like rescue. Sometimes it looks like someone seeing your art and recognizing that your pain has produced something beautiful, something true, something worth preserving. The woman's words had broken me that morning, but broken things I would learn, sometimes let the light in. The weeks that followed that November morning blended together like paint, mixing on a palette, ugly browns and grays that spoke of cold, hunger, and the slow erosion of hope. Chicago's winter had arrived with the vengeance it was famous for, turning the city into a battlefield where only the strongest, luckiest, or most invisible survived. I was none of those things anymore. The woman's words, "Jesus wouldn't save you, you're too far gone for salvation," had taken root in my mind like a cancer. They changed how I saw myself, how I moved through the world, how I interacted with the handful of people who still acknowledged my existence. I stopped asking for help. What was the point? If I was beyond redemption, beyond salvation, then I was beyond human kindness too. But I couldn't stop drawing. It became compulsive, like a prayer I didn't know I was saying. Every morning when I woke up on the cathedral steps, stiff and aching from sleeping on stone, the first thing I reached for was my sketchbook. Every face I saw, every moment of cruelty or kindness, every detail of street life that polite society preferred to ignore, it all went onto those yellowed, water-stained pages. The drawings changed after that morning with the woman. They became raw, more brutal in their honesty. I stopped trying to find beauty in the architecture around me and started documenting the truth that nobody wanted to see. I drew the businessman who kicked over my cup of change because I was cluttering up his morning commute to the office. I drew the security guard who turned a hose on the doorway where I'd been sleeping, because the store owner complained about the homeless problem affecting his business. I drew the police officer who moved me along from park benches with the casual indifference of someone shooing away pigeons, but mostly I drew the other invisible people. There was Tommy Martinez, 63 years old, who had lost his left leg below the knee to an IED outside Fallujah 15 years earlier. The VA had given him a prosthetic and a disability check that barely covered rent on a studio apartment in the worst part of the city. When his building was condemned and he couldn't find another place he could afford, he'd ended up on the streets with nothing but his military duffel bag and a Purple Heart he kept wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the rain. Tommy had been out here longer than anyone else I knew. He had survival skills learned in a war zone and stories that could make you laugh or cry depending on his mood. He knew which alleys were safe at night, which shelters to avoid, which churches actually helped people versus the ones that just wanted to preach at you. But the street had taken its toll. The stump of his missing leg was infected more often than not, an angry red wound that never quite healed in the unsanitary conditions we lived in. He self-medicated with whatever alcohol he could afford, and sometimes I'd find him talking to buddies from his unit who existed only in his memories. I drew Tommy on his good days and his bad ones. Tommy sharing his food with newcomers who didn't know how to navigate the informal economy of the streets. Tommy teaching a kid named Jake how to panhandle without looking threatening, how to make eye contact but not too much, how to say thank you even when people ignored you. Tommy, during one of his flashback episodes, curled up behind a dumpster, calling out coordinates to artillery units that couldn't hear him anymore. Then there was Sarah Chen, 19 years old. Though the streets had aged her a decade in the 6 months she'd been out here, she'd run away from a group home in Milwaukee where older kids had been trading sexual favors with the staff for basic necessities. Stop. Right here. I need you to understand something. Sarah could be your daughter, your sister, your friend. Comment below if you knew that many homeless youth are actually running from abuse, not to drugs. This story is about to get even more heartbreaking, but also more hopeful. If you're starting to see homeless people differently, hit that subscribe button. She'd hitchhiked to Chicago thinking a bigger city would offer more opportunities, more places to disappear, more ways to survive. Instead, she'd found predators who saw her youth and desperation as opportunities of their own. The track marks on her arms told a story she didn't like to talk about, of how quickly survival could become something else entirely. She was smart, had been in advanced placement classes before her parents died in a car accident and the state took custody. But intelligence doesn't protect you from the kind of hunger that makes terrible choices seem reasonable. Sarah was trying to get clean, cycling through the few treatment programs that would take someone without insurance or documentation. But the waiting lists were long, the programs were underfunded, and the streets were always there when the system failed her. I drew her reading books she found in dumpsters, trying to maintain some connection to the person she'd been before. I drew her helping other girls recognize the warning signs of traffickers, sharing hard-earned wisdom about staying safe in a world that wanted to consume her. And I drew the ones who didn't survive. Betty Morrison was 74 years old, a former teacher who had worked in Chicago public schools for 40 years, before her pension was gutted by municipal budget cuts. Her Social Security wasn't enough to cover rent anywhere in the city, and her children lived in other states, struggling with their own financial problems. She'd been evicted from 3 different senior housing facilities for late payments before ending up on the streets. Betty was the maternal heart of our informal community. She somehow always had food to share, even when she was hungry herself. She knew everyone's story, remembered birthdays, offered comfort when the despair became overwhelming. She had taught second grade for most of her career, and sometimes she'd slip into that teacher voice, gently correcting grammar or encouraging someone to keep trying when they wanted to give up. The cold snap in December killed her on a night when the shelters were full and the warming centers had closed due to a city budget crisis. They found her 3 blocks from the cathedral, curled up in a doorway with her coat pulled over her head, clutching a plastic bag that contained the few photographs she'd managed to save from her old life. This is the part that made me cry when Marcus first told me this story. Betty died because the shelters were full. Comment if you think a teacher who served children for 40 years deserved better. If this is breaking your heart like it broke mine, please subscribe. Betty's story needs to be remembered. Pictures of her students, her children, Christmas mornings from decades past when the world had made sense. I drew Betty's face from memory, trying to capture not just how she looked in death, but who she had been in life. The kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the gap-toothed smile that could make a grown man feel like everything would be okay. The way she hummed old gospel songs while distributing whatever food she'd managed to gather, as if she was still teaching children, still nurturing the next generation. The unnamed man who died behind the dumpster 2 days after Betty was a mystery we never solved. middle-aged, well-dressed enough that he'd probably been housed recently. He clutched a photograph of 2 children who would never know what happened to their father. No ID, no one to claim the body, no story except the one I tried to tell in graphite and paper. A drawing of dignity maintained even in death, of love that survived even when the lover didn't. It was around this time that Father Miguel Martinez started paying attention to me. St. Mary's had several priests, but Father Martinez was different from the others. He was younger, maybe early 40s, with silver threading through his black hair and hands that looked like they'd known real work before he took his vows. I'd learned from Tommy that Father Martinez had grown up in Pilsen, the son of immigrants who had worked construction and cleaning jobs to put him through seminary. He understood poverty not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. Unlike the older priests who seemed uncomfortable with the homeless people who gathered around the church, Father Martinez made it a point to learn our names, to ask about our stories, to treat us like parishioners rather than problems to be managed. He ran the community outreach programs, and I'd often see him loading boxes of food into his battered Honda Civic for distribution around the neighborhood. But he never pushed religion on us, never made church attendance a condition for receiving help, never suggested that our circumstances were divine punishment for moral failures. That alone made him different from most of the clergy I'd encountered. The morning he first approached me was brutally cold, the kind of December day when the wind off Lake Michigan felt like it was cutting through your bones. I'd been awake since 4 a.m. because the cold made sleeping impossible, and I was sketching to keep my hands moving, to maintain enough circulation to prevent frostbite. "That's beautiful work," he said, appearing beside me with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the frigid air. I looked up, surprised. Most people, even the helpful ones, didn't get close enough to actually see what I was drawing. "It's black," he said, offering me one of the cups. "Hope that's okay. We ran out of cream yesterday." I accepted the coffee, with hands so stiff from cold I could barely wrap my fingers around the cup. The warmth was immediate and almost painful as sensation returned to my numb fingers. "Thank you, Father." Instead of the usual pleasantries and quick exit I expected, he sat down beside me on the stone steps. The gesture surprised me. Most people, even the ones trying to help, maintained their distance. Physical proximity to homelessness seemed to make people uncomfortable, as if poverty might be contagious. "I've been watching you draw," he said. "Every morning for weeks now. You're very talented." I looked down at my sketchbook, which was open to a drawing I'd done of the cathedral's interior from memory. I'd never actually been inside. Homeless people weren't exactly welcomed in most churches during services, but I'd glimpsed it through the open doors and reconstructed the space from architectural principles I still remembered from my old life. "It helps pass the time," I said, the standard deflection I used when people commented on my drawing. "It's more than that," Father Martinez said. "You see things, details that most people miss, the way light falls across stone, the expressions on people's faces, the dignity in difficult circumstances." He gestured toward the sketchbook. "May I see more of your work?" Something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. There was no pity there, no condescension, just genuine curiosity and what looked like respect for the work itself. I hesitated. The sketchbook contained 3 months of my life on the streets. Every moment of degradation, every encounter with cruelty, every face of suffering I'd witnessed. It was raw and ugly and true, in ways that made comfortable people uncomfortable. It was evidence of a world that most people preferred to pretend didn't exist. But something about Father Martinez felt different. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the simple fact that he'd sat down beside me instead of looking down at me. But I found myself handing over the sketchbook. He accepted it with the reverence you'd show a sacred text, holding it carefully as he began to turn the pages. I watched his face as he moved through the drawings chronologically, seeing the progression from my early architectural sketches to the harsh portraits of street life that had consumed my work after the woman's cruel words. His expression changed as he went deeper into the book. When he reached the drawing of Tommy during one of his flashback episodes, Father Martinez's breath caught audibly. "You know him?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Tommy Martinez. Any relation?" "My uncle," Father Martinez said quietly. "My father's brother. We've been looking for him for 2 years. He disappeared from the VA hospital after they amputated his leg, and we couldn't find him." I felt something shift in my chest. "He talks about you sometimes, about his nephew who became a priest. He's proud of you, but he's also ashamed that you might see him like this." Father Martinez nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "Where is he now?" "There's a camp under the Lower Wacker overpass. He usually sleeps there when it gets this cold. But Father, you should know, he's not well. The infection in his leg, the drinking, the trauma, he needs medical attention." "We'll take care of him," Father Martinez said firmly. Whatever he needs. He continued through the sketchbook, and I watched him discover my documentation of street life, the good and the bad, the moments of humanity, and the instances of cruelty. When he reached Betty's portrait, his hands began to shake. "She came to our soup kitchen," he said. "Sweet lady, always helping serve even though she needed the meal herself. We looked for her when she stopped coming. She froze to death 3 blocks from here," I said. The shelters were full. Father Martinez closed his eyes for a moment, and I could see him processing not just the information, but the guilt that came with it. How many people like Betty were dying just outside the reach of the help the church tried to provide? When he reached the self-portraits, the ones where I'd drawn my own face growing thinner, more hollow, more desperate with each passing week, his composure finally broke. "Marcus," he said, and I realized I'd never told him my name. He must have learned it from talking to Tommy or one of the other street people. "These drawings aren't just art, they're testimony." Testimony to what? To the fact that you're still human, that you still see beauty and truth even in the darkest places, that you refuse to let the world make you invisible. I felt something tight and painful in my chest. Someone told me I was beyond salvation, that Jesus wouldn't save me. Father Martinez looked at me directly, his eyes intense. "Whoever told you that has never read the Gospels. Jesus spent most of his time with people the religious establishment had written off. Tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, the mentally ill, the ones society called unsavable. But I'm not religious, Father. I don't even know if I believe in God anymore." "That's okay," he said simply. "God believes in you, and these drawings prove it. You see the divine in the discarded, the sacred in the suffering. That's not the work of someone beyond redemption. That's the work of someone with a prophetic eye." He stood up, dusting snow off his coat, but he didn't leave. Instead, he looked down at me with something I hadn't seen in months, genuine respect. "Will you come inside? It's warm, and I'd like you to meet someone who needs to see your work." I stared at him. "Inside the church? It's God's house, Marcus. That means it's your house too." For the first time in months, I stood up and followed someone through a door instead of being turned away from it. As we walked toward the massive oak doors of St. Mary's Cathedral, I felt something I'd forgotten existed. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as beyond redemption as I'd been led to believe. The woman's words had broken me that November morning, but as I crossed the threshold into the warm, sacred space of the cathedral, I began to understand that sometimes being broken is the first step toward being rebuilt. Here's a question that might change your perspective forever. What if the people we ignore on the streets have talents, dreams, and stories that could inspire us? Marcus is about to discover something that will blow your mind about human potential. Comment below. What talent do you have that people might not see? Walking into St. Mary's Cathedral was like entering a different dimension, one where warmth and beauty still existed in a world that had seemed determined to strip both away from me. The first thing that hit me was the warmth, not just the physical relief from Chicago's brutal winter, but something deeper, more encompassing. The kind of warmth that comes from spaces built for gathering, for community, for the acknowledgement of shared human experiences. The cathedral's interior was breathtaking in a way that my architectural training helped me appreciate, but my current circumstances made almost painful to witness. Soaring Gothic arches drew the eye upward toward ribbed vaulting that seemed to dissolve into shadow and golden light. Stained glass windows told stories in jeweled colors that painted everything they touched. The worn stone floors, the wooden pews polished smooth by decades of worshippers, the altar where hundreds of candles flickered like earthbound stars. But what struck me most was the silence. Not empty silence, but the kind of profound quiet that comes from a space that has absorbed countless prayers, confessions, moments of grief and celebration. It was the silence of accumulated human experience, and for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. My boots, worn through at the soles, held together with duct tape and hope, squeaked against the polished floor as Father Martinez led me through the nave toward the back of the church. I was acutely conscious of how out of place I must have looked in this sacred space. My unwashed clothes and unkempt appearance, a stark contrast to the cathedral's dignified beauty. "Don't worry about the noise," Father Martinez said, noticing my careful steps. "This place has heard everything over the past century and a half. Tears, laughter, arguments, confessions, children crying during baptisms, teenagers trying to sneak out during long sermons. A few squeaky boots won't disturb anyone." We passed a side chapel where an elderly woman knelt before a statue of the Virgin Mary, her lips moving in silent prayer. She glanced up as we walked by, and instead of the disapproval I expected, she offered a gentle nod of acknowledgement. It was such a small gesture, but after months of being looked through or looked down upon, even basic human recognition felt revolutionary. Father Martinez opened a door marked Community Outreach and gestured for me to enter. The space beyond was a sharp contrast to the cathedral's Gothic grandeur, a functional, cluttered room that spoke of real work being done. Folding tables stacked with donated clothes, boxes of canned goods organized by expiration date, filing cabinets overflowing with resources for people navigating Chicago's social services bureaucracy. A bulletin board covered with thank you notes and photos from people the church had helped told stories of small victories in the larger war against poverty and despair. "Sister Catherine," Father Martinez called toward a smaller office. "Could you come here for a moment? I'd like you to meet someone." A woman emerged from what looked like a paperwork battleground, desk covered with grant applications, service reports, and correspondence with city agencies. She was probably in her mid-60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She wore jeans, a faded Northwestern University sweatshirt, and sensible shoes that had clearly walked many miles in service to others. But what struck me immediately was her presence. This wasn't someone playing at charity or fulfilling religious obligations. This was someone who had seen real suffering and responded with practical compassion. Someone whose faith was measured not in prayers recited, but in problems solved. "Sister Catherine," Father Martinez said, "this is Marcus Thompson, the artist I've been telling you about." She studied me for a moment, and I braced myself for the familiar assessment, the quick calculation of worth, the determination of whether I was deserving of help or merely another drain on limited resources. Instead, she smiled, and it was genuine warmth without a trace of condescension. "Father Martinez has been talking about your work for weeks," she said. "He's convinced you have something important to say, and his instincts about people are usually spot on." "I just draw what I see," I said, suddenly feeling foolish for being there, for taking up space in a room clearly dedicated to people with more urgent needs than mine. "That's exactly what makes it important," Sister Catherine replied. "Most people walk through the world with their eyes closed to inconvenient truths. Artists like you force us to see what we'd rather ignore." Father Martinez moved to the central table and gestured for me to place my sketchbook there. "Show her the one of Tommy," he said quietly, and I heard the weight of personal pain in his voice. I opened to the page where I'd captured Tommy on one of his better days, when he'd been sharing stories about his unit in Afghanistan. Despite everything he'd lost, his leg, his housing, his connection to civilian life, there was still humanity shining through his eyes, still dignity that the streets hadn't been able to steal. Sister Catherine leaned over the drawing, studying it with an intensity that made me nervous. Her finger traced the lines of Tommy's face, the careful detail I'd put into capturing not just his physical appearance, but the essence of who he was beneath the trauma and addiction. "You see him," she said finally, looking up at me with something like wonder in her eyes. "Not just his circumstances, but him, the person he was before, the person he still is underneath everything that's happened to him." She began turning pages slowly, just as Father Martinez had done, but her reactions were different. Where Father Martinez had shown recognition and concern, Sister Catherine displayed analytical assessment. She was seeing the drawings not just as art, but as evidence, documentation of a reality that social services and government agencies tried to quantify, but rarely captured with such human precision. When she reached the portraits of Betty Morrison, the elderly teacher who had frozen to death, Sister Catherine had to stop and take several deep breaths. "We failed her," she said quietly. "We have soup kitchens and clothing drives and emergency assistance programs, and we still failed her." "You can't save everyone," I said, the words automatic after months of watching good people destroy themselves trying to help in an impossible situation. "But we can see everyone," she replied firmly. "We can acknowledge their dignity, their worth, their humanity. These drawings do that. They bear witness to lives that matter, to people who deserve better than what we've collectively allowed to happen." Father Martinez pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Marcus. We want to talk to you about something." I sat reluctantly, clutching my sketchbook defensively. In my experience, when authority figures wanted to talk to you about something, It usually meant problems were coming. We've been working on an initiative, Sister Catherine began, settling into the chair across from me, to change how people in our community understand and respond to homelessness. Too often, people think of it as an abstract problem to be solved through policy and funding rather than recognizing the human beings at its center. Your art could be part of that, Father Martinez added. Not to exploit your experience, but to help people understand the reality behind the statistics. I felt familiar cynicism rising in my throat. You want to put my drawings in some exhibition? Make wealthy donors feel better about themselves by looking at homeless art while they write tax-deductible checks? No, Sister Catherine said with enough force to make me reconsider my assumptions. We want to challenge people, make them uncomfortable, force them to confront their own assumptions and prejudices about poverty, addiction, mental illness, and social responsibility. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Marcus, someone once told you that Jesus wouldn't save you. That person was not only morally wrong, but theologically ignorant. But their cruelty inadvertently gave birth to something beautiful. It made you angry enough to document truths that most people refuse to acknowledge. I still don't understand what you're asking of me. Father Martinez exchanged a meaningful glance with Sister Catherine, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of working together on difficult problems. There was something they weren't telling me, something bigger than just displaying my artwork. We want you to stay here, Father Martinez said finally. Not as charity, not as some feel-good project, but as a member of our community. We have a small apartment above the community center that's been empty for months. The previous occupant was an AmeriCorps volunteer who finished her service and moved back to her family in Oregon. Wait, did you catch that? They're not offering charity, they're offering community. They see Marcus's value, not his circumstances. Comment if you think everyone deserves a chance like this. If this story is changing how you see homeless people, smash that subscribe button. The ending will absolutely amaze you. Sister Catherine picked up where he left off. In exchange for helping with our outreach programs and continuing to create art that tells these stories, the stories that need to be told, you'd have a place to live. A real home, Marcus. Not a temporary shelter bed or a spot on someone's couch, but a place that's yours. I stared at them, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke, or if desperation had finally driven me to hallucinations. You want to give me a home? We want to offer you the opportunity to build one, Sister Catherine corrected gently. There's a significant difference. This wouldn't be charity, it would be work. Real work with real responsibilities, real expectations, and real consequences if you don't meet them. She pulled out a manila folder from beneath a stack of papers. We've been developing a comprehensive approach to homelessness that goes beyond just providing temporary shelter and meals. We're talking about art therapy, job training, mental health support, addiction counseling, a holistic program that addresses the root causes rather than just managing the symptoms. And you think I could contribute to that? I think you could lead parts of it, she said, her voice carrying the weight of complete conviction. Marcus, you've lived this experience. You understand it from the inside, in ways that social workers and counselors and policymakers never will. More importantly, you found a way to process that experience, to transform it into something meaningful through your art. Father Martinez opened my sketchbook to a drawing I'd done of a young man named Kevin, barely 21, who'd aged out of the foster system with no family connections, no job skills, and no understanding of how to navigate adult responsibilities. I'd captured him during one of his panic attacks, the overwhelming fear that came from realizing you were completely alone in a world that seemed designed to crush people like him. This young man came to our emergency assistance program last week, Father Martinez said. Kevin Morrison, he's Betty's grandson, actually. Been looking for her since he got out of foster care. He never knew she was on the streets. My throat tightened. Betty had talked about her grandson constantly, worried about him, saved part of her meager food supplies in case he ever found her. She'd died carrying guilt about not being able to provide him with a home. He's staying in our transitional housing program now, Sister Catherine continued, but he's struggling with depression, anxiety, survivor's guilt. Traditional counseling isn't reaching him, but when Father Martinez showed him your drawing of his grandmother, Kevin broke down. For the first time since we'd met him, he was able to talk about his feelings, his fears, his grief. Art becomes a language, Father Martinez explained, when regular words aren't enough. You've created a visual vocabulary for experiences that our society doesn't know how to discuss. I looked around the room, at the donation boxes, the resource lists, the photos of people who had been helped. What kind of responsibilities are we talking about? Sister Catherine smiled, recognizing that my question meant I was seriously considering their offer. Meal service coordination, clothing distribution, connecting people with social services, intake interviews for emergency assistance, basic community outreach work that dozens of people do every day. But also something new, Father Martinez added, art therapy sessions, giving people a way to express their experiences, to process trauma, to rediscover their own creativity and self-worth. I'm not a therapist, Father. I don't have any training in counseling or psychology. You have something more valuable, Sister Catherine said. You have lived experience. You understand what it feels like to be invisible, to be written off, to have your humanity questioned. That's worth more than any degree when it comes to connecting with people who are going through similar struggles. She pulled out several sheets of paper from the folder. We've already received preliminary approval from the diocese for a pilot program, 6 months of funding for art supplies, a small stipend for a program coordinator, space for workshops. If it works, if we can demonstrate measurable outcomes, we can apply for larger grants, maybe even city funding. You've already started planning this. We've been planning it since Father Martinez first told me about your work, she admitted. Marcus, in 30 years of social work, I've rarely seen documentation this honest, this powerful. These drawings don't just show what homelessness looks like, they show what it feels like. They humanize people that society has dehumanized. I thought about the past 3 months, the cold nights, the hungry days, the constant sense of being unwanted and unwelcome everywhere I went. But I also thought about the people I'd met, the stories I'd collected, the faces I'd drawn. Tommy with his war stories and infected leg, Sarah with her intelligence trapped by addiction and trauma, Betty with her teacher's heart and generous spirit. All the unnamed faces who had shared their stories, their food, their small acts of kindness in a world that seemed designed to crush kindness. The woman who told me Jesus wouldn't save me, I said slowly. She was standing right outside this building when she said it. And now you're inside it, Father Martinez observed. Maybe that tells you something about the reliability of her theological expertise. I opened my sketchbook to a blank page and stared at it. For months I'd been filling pages with other people's stories, documenting their pain and resilience and humanity. Maybe it was time to start writing my own story's next chapter. When would I start? Sister Catherine's smile could have lit up the entire cathedral. How about right now? Let's go see your new home. We left the community outreach office and walked through a different part of the church complex, past classrooms used for religious education and meeting spaces for various parish organizations. Father Martinez pointed out practical details, where the laundry was located, how to access the kitchen, which doors required keys, and which stayed open during community hours. The apartment was on the second floor of a building that connected to the main church through a covered walkway. Sister Catherine unlocked the door and gestured for me to enter first. It was small, maybe 400 square feet total, but it was clean, warm, and completely private. A main room with a couch, small table, and basic kitchen facilities. A separate bedroom with a twin bed, dresser, and most importantly, a window that faced east toward the lake. A bathroom with a shower that had hot water and water pressure. A closet with actual hanging space for clothes. But what struck me most was the light. After months of sleeping in doorways and under overpasses, the simple luxury of natural light streaming through clean windows felt almost sacred. The previous tenant left some basic furniture, Sister Catherine explained. Nothing fancy, but functional. We can help you get anything else you might need. I walked to the window and looked out at the city I'd been wandering for months, seeing it from a completely different perspective. The same buildings, the same streets, but viewed from a place of safety and belonging rather than desperation and exclusion. There's one more thing, Father Martinez said, his voice carrying a note of excitement. The main room has excellent light for drawing. North-facing windows, very even illumination throughout the day. We thought you might want to set up a proper workspace. I turned back to them, these two people who had seen something in my desperate sketches that I hadn't even recognized myself. Why are you doing this? Really? Sister Catherine considered the question seriously. Because 30 years ago, I was where you are now. Different circumstances. Addiction instead of unemployment. Family problems instead of economic collapse. But the same fundamental experience of being written off by society, of having my worth questioned, of being told I was beyond help. What changed? Someone saw me, she said simply. Someone looked past the surface circumstances to the person underneath. Someone offered me not just charity, but the opportunity to rebuild my life with dignity. Father Martinez nodded. The church talks a lot about salvation, Marcus, but real salvation isn't some abstract theological concept. It's what happens when people refuse to give up on each other, when communities choose inclusion over exclusion, when we recognize the divine in the discarded. I looked around the small apartment, my apartment, and felt something I'd forgotten existed. Not just hope, which was too fragile and had been broken too many times. Something stronger, purpose maybe, the sense that my experience, as painful as it had been, might actually matter for something. "I want to show you one more thing," Sister Catherine said, leading me back to the main room. She pointed to the wall opposite the windows. "We thought this might be perfect for displaying artwork. Your drawings, work from the art therapy sessions, rotating exhibitions that help tell these stories to people who need to hear them." I could envision it, the faces from my sketchbook enlarged and properly displayed, Tommy's dignity preserved in graphite and paper, Betty's kindness immortalized, all the unnamed humanity I documented given the respect and attention it deserved. "There's something else," Father Martinez said quietly. "Something we should tell you about the woman who spoke to you that morning." I tensed, not sure I was ready to revisit that encounter. "Her name is Patricia Hoffman. She's been coming to Mass here for about 2 months, sitting in the back pews, clearly struggling with something. Last week, she approached me after service. She told me about the encounter with you, about what she said. She's been carrying tremendous guilt." Hold up. The woman who said those cruel words has been haunted by them? Plot twist incoming. Comment your prediction. Do you think she's truly sorry or just guilty? The final chapter will shock you. Don't forget to subscribe. Why? Her son has been in and out of rehab for heroin addiction for the past 3 years. The morning she spoke to you, she'd just spent the night at the police station after he was arrested again. She was angry and scared, and she took it out on you. Sister Catherine added, "She's been volunteering at a recovery center, trying to understand addiction better, trying to find ways to help her son and people like him. She specifically asked if there was any way she could make amends for what she said to you. I thought about that morning, about the words that had broken something inside me, about the chain of events that had led me from that moment of despair to this moment of possibility. Maybe," I said slowly, "her words did save me. Not the way she intended, but they made me angry enough to keep drawing, to keep documenting what I saw. And that anger, that refusal to disappear, led me here." "That's a very generous way to look at it," Father Martinez observed. "I'm not ready to forgive her yet," I said honestly, "but I'm not ready to hate her either. Maybe that's progress." As we left the apartment and walked back through the church, I realized that salvation wasn't what I'd thought it was. It hadn't come with trumpets and miracles. It had come through community, through people who saw my art and recognized my humanity, through the transformation of suffering into service. The woman's words had been meant to destroy me. Instead, they had led me to this place, to these people, to this opportunity to transform my experience into something that might help others avoid the despair I'd lived through. Maybe that's how grace really works, not despite our brokenness, but through it, turning our deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. 10 months later, I was standing in the main gallery of the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, watching people encounter my drawings in ways I never could have imagined. The exhibition, Scene, Portraits from the Margins, had been open for 2 weeks, and the response had been overwhelming. Not just in terms of attendance, though the crowds were larger than anyone had expected, but in the quality of engagement. People weren't just looking at the artwork, they were being changed by it. I watched a businessman in an expensive suit study my drawing of Betty Morrison for 15 minutes, tears streaming down his face as he read the placard explaining how a former teacher had died of exposure 3 blocks from a church, with empty beds in its warming center. This businessman probably walked past homeless people every day. Now he's crying over Betty's story. Comment if you think art can change hearts faster than arguments. This transformation is exactly why I share these stories, and why you need to subscribe to see more. A group of high school students stood transfixed before Maria Santos's drawing of her dream apartment. She was a single mother who'd been evicted 4 times in 2 years, and her artwork showed not just what she'd lost, but what she still hoped to build for her children. But the real transformation had begun months before the museum exhibition, in the small community room at St. Mary's, where our art therapy sessions had grown from a handful of participants to a weekly gathering of 30 or more people. The program had exceeded every expectation Sister Catherine and Father Martinez had dared to set. What started as basic art therapy, giving people materials and space to express their experiences, had evolved into something much more comprehensive. Tommy Martinez, clean for 4 months now and fitted with a proper prosthetic through the VA services Father Martinez had helped him navigate, had become our co-facilitator, using his military experience to help other veterans process their trauma through visual storytelling. Sarah Chen, 8 months clean and working toward her GED, ran workshops for younger participants, teaching them techniques she'd learned while studying digital art online using the computer lab we'd set up in the community center. Her own drawings had evolved from desperate self-portraits to complex pieces exploring themes of recovery, identity, and the possibility of redemption. Kevin Morrison, Betty's grandson, had become one of our most dedicated volunteers after working through his grief by creating a series of portraits of his grandmother based on my drawings and his own memories. His artwork helped him process not just the loss, but the guilt he carried about not finding her before she died. Through his art, he was able to honor her memory while forgiving himself for circumstances beyond his control. The sessions themselves had become something sacred, though we never used religious language to describe them. People would arrive carrying the weight of their experiences, trauma, loss, addiction, poverty, discrimination, and through the simple act of putting pencil to paper, they would find ways to externalize what had been eating them from the inside. It's not about creating masterpieces, I would tell new participants, echoing what Sister Catherine had told me months earlier. It's about creating truth. Draw what you see, what you feel, what you've survived. Your story matters, and your story deserves to be told. And they did draw. They drew the faces of children they'd lost to the foster system. They drew the apartments they'd been evicted from. They drew the jobs they'd lost, the relationships that had ended, the dreams that had been deferred but not abandoned. Each drawing was an act of resistance against invisibility, a declaration that their lives had meaning even when society suggested otherwise. The apartment above the community center had become more than just my home. It had become a workspace, a gallery, and a sanctuary. The walls were covered with artwork from our sessions, a rotating exhibition of human resilience that told stories most people never heard. I had a proper drafting table now, donated by an architectural firm that had heard about the program, and my drawings had evolved beyond documentation to something approaching healing. But the work wasn't easy. For every success story like Tommy or Sarah, there were losses that cut deep. Michael, a 19-year-old who'd been kicked out by his family for being gay, had overdosed 2 weeks after creating a beautiful series of drawings about acceptance and belonging. Jennifer, a middle-aged woman battling mental illness, had disappeared one night, leaving behind only a sketchbook filled with portraits of the demons she was fighting. We can't save everyone, Sister Catherine reminded me during one of our monthly planning meetings, seeing how Michael's death had affected me. But we can witness everyone. We can make sure their stories are told, their dignity preserved. The museum exhibition had grown organically from our community work. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the curator who had first seen our drawings, had spent months at St. Mary's, not just documenting the artwork, but understanding the stories behind it. She was determined that the exhibition wouldn't exploit our experiences, but would honor them, giving viewers insight into realities they might otherwise never encounter. This isn't poverty tourism, she had explained to the museum board. This is social documentation of the highest artistic order. These works force viewers to confront their assumptions about homelessness, addiction, mental illness, and social responsibility. The opening reception had been unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The museum's main gallery had been transformed into a powerful statement about human dignity and social justice. My original sketchbook drawings anchored the show, the brutal honesty of those first desperate months on the street, but they were surrounded by works from our entire art therapy community. Tommy's portraits of fellow veterans, Sarah's digital artwork exploring themes of recovery, Kevin's memorial pieces honoring his grandmother, Maria's architectural drawings of the housing she dreamed of providing for her children. But more than the artwork itself, it was the presence of the artists that made the evening powerful. Nearly 20 members of our community had come to the opening, many of them experiencing a museum for the first time. Watching them stand beside their displayed work, explaining their stories to curious viewers, was one of the most profound experiences of my life. I never thought anyone would want to see this, Maria had told a small group gathered around her drawings. I thought my problems were too small, too personal, but putting them on paper helped me understand that housing isn't just about having a roof. It's about having dignity, security, the ability to build a life. The moment that changed everything, though, happened 2 hours into the reception. I was standing near my self-portrait from that terrible winter, the drawing I'd made after the woman told me Jesus wouldn't save me. When I noticed someone approaching, I recognized her immediately, even though months had passed. The same determined walk, the same expensive clothing, though something about her posture seemed different. Less defensive, perhaps, more uncertain. Patricia Hoffman stopped in front of my self-portrait, and I watched her read the placard. Self-Portrait in Winter by Marcus Thompson, graphite on paper, created while homeless, outside St. Mary's Cathedral. Her face went through a series of emotions as the reality of what she was seeing sank in. Recognition, shock, what looked like deep shame. Here it is, the moment you've been waiting for. The woman who said Jesus wouldn't save you is face to face with proof of Marcus's humanity. I'm getting goosebumps just writing this. Comment your prediction. What happens next? But first, make sure you're subscribed, because this confrontation is epic. She stood there for several minutes, studying the evidence of what her words had done, what they had failed to do. I approached her slowly, not wanting to cause a scene in the crowded gallery. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady and confident in a way it hadn't been that winter morning. "I believe we've met before." She turned, and I saw her recognize me immediately. The fear was there again, but different now. Not fear of me, but fear of confronting what she'd done. "I remember you," she said quietly. "I remember what I said. You told me Jesus wouldn't save me," I said, not accusingly, but simply stating fact. "Do you remember that?" Her composure cracked completely. "I'm sorry. I was having the worst day of my life, and I took it out on you, and I've thought about those words every single day since then. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong." I studied her face, seeing past the expensive clothes and defensive posture to something deeper. Pain, guilt, the kind of hurt that makes people lash out at safer targets than their real problems. "What was making that day so terrible?" I asked. She looked surprised by the question. "My son had been arrested again. Heroin. I'd spent the night at the police station, and I was angry and scared, and when I saw you asking for help, I made you the target of everything I was feeling about him. Where is he now?" "Rehab. It's his 4th attempt, but this time seems different. He's been clean for 6 months, and he's been coming to support groups at St. Mary's. He knows what I said to you." He was horrified. I nodded. "Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. Your son isn't beyond saving, and neither was I." We stood together in front of my self-portrait. Two people who had wounded each other finding themselves on the other side of that encounter, both fundamentally changed. "I've been volunteering at a recovery center," she said quietly. "And I've been attending Mass at St. Mary's, trying to understand what faith really means. Father Martinez has been helping me work through the guilt, the anger at myself. And what have you learned? That I had turned my pain into judgment of others. That I was using my faith as a weapon instead of a tool for healing. That everyone is closer to needing help than we want to admit." I looked around the gallery at all the faces on the walls, people who had been written off, discarded, deemed unsavable by a society that found it easier to judge than to understand. "You want to know something?" I said. "Your words that morning, they hurt more than the cold, more than the hunger, more than being ignored by hundreds of people every day. But they also saved my life." She looked confused. "They made me angry enough to keep drawing, to keep documenting what I was seeing and experiencing. That anger, that refusal to disappear, led me to Father Martinez, to Sister Catherine, to this work. Your words were meant to destroy me, but they ended up transforming me." Mind blown. The words meant to destroy him actually saved him. Comment if you've ever had something terrible lead to something beautiful in your life. This is why I believe everything happens for a reason. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe. We need more people to hear stories like this. She was crying now, quietly, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way to genuine emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said. "None of us deserve grace," I replied. "That's what makes it grace, but we can accept it, and we can choose to extend it to others." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small drawing I'd been carrying, a sketch I'd done the week before of the cathedral steps where we'd first met. But in this version, instead of showing the scene as it had been, I'd drawn it as it could be. People sitting together, sharing food and conversation, seeing each other as human beings rather than problems to be avoided. "I want you to have this," I said, offering her the drawing. She accepted it with shaking hands. "Why?" "Because transformation isn't a destination, it's a process. You've started that process, and this drawing represents not where we were, but where we can choose to go." Patricia stayed for the rest of the evening, moving through the gallery with a new perspective, stopping to read every placard, to understand every story. Before she left, she approached me one more time. "Is there anything I can do? Any way I can help with your work at the church?" "Actually, yes," I said. "We're always looking for volunteers who understand that recovery from addiction, from trauma, from the circumstances that lead to homelessness, isn't a simple process. People who understand that judgment doesn't heal, but community can." "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like to learn how to help instead of hurt." 6 months later, Patricia had become one of our most dedicated volunteers, working specifically with families affected by addiction. Her son, David, had completed his program and started attending our art sessions, using drawing to process his experiences with addiction and recovery. Both of them had learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about transforming it into wisdom that can help others. The program had continued to grow, expanding beyond St. Mary's to include partnerships with other churches, community centers, and social service organizations across Chicago. The art therapy model we'd developed was being replicated in Detroit, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. My drawings had been featured in a book about homelessness that was being used in social work programs across the country. But the real measure of success wasn't in the programs or the recognition. It was in the faces of the people who came through our doors every week, people who arrived believing they were invisible and left knowing they were seen, people who had been told they were beyond help and discovered they were capable of helping others. I still lived above the community center, still drew every day, still worked with people society had written off. But now I understood something I hadn't when I was sleeping on those cathedral steps. We're all just one or two bad breaks away from needing grace, and we're all one or two acts of genuine compassion away from providing it. The cathedral bells still chimed every hour, just as they had during that terrible winter when I thought I was beyond redemption. But now when I heard them, they didn't mark time passing in desperation. They marked time spent in purpose, in community, in the kind of salvation that comes not from avoiding human brokenness, but from finding the sacred within it. Jesus wouldn't save you, Patricia had said that November morning, certain she was pronouncing divine judgment. She was wrong about everything, not because Jesus had swooped down from heaven to rescue me, but because salvation had been there all along, waiting in the connections between broken people who refuse to let each other disappear, waiting in the moment when someone sees your pain and recognizes your humanity, waiting in the choice to transform suffering into service, invisibility into witness, judgment into grace. That morning on the cathedral steps, Patricia thought she was delivering a final verdict on my worth. Instead, she was participating in the beginning of both our redemptions. Her cruel words had been the catalyst that led me to discover my purpose, and confronting the impact of those words had led her to examine her own capacity for both harm and healing. A year after the museum exhibition, I received a letter from a social worker in Phoenix who had read about our program. She was working with a community of homeless veterans and wanted to start a similar art therapy initiative. Enclosed with her letter was a photograph of a man in his 60s, sitting on a park bench with a sketchbook in his lap, drawing portraits of his fellow homeless community members. His name is Robert, the social worker wrote. He used to be an engineer before PTSD, and addiction cost him everything, but he never stopped drawing. He says art is how he stays human when the world tries to make him invisible. I think you would understand each other. I did understand. I understood that salvation isn't a moment but a movement, not an event but a process that spreads from one person to another, from one community to the next. I understood that the divine doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it whispers through graphite on paper, through the simple act of seeing and being seen, through the choice to treat the discarded as sacred. The woman who told me Jesus wouldn't save me was wrong about everything except one thing. I did need saving. We all do. But salvation doesn't come from avoiding human brokenness. It comes from diving deep into that brokenness and finding the light that was always there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be shared, waiting to transform everything it touches. That's the kind of salvation that lasts. That's the kind that saves not just one person, but everyone they're brave enough to see. And that is how Marcus Thompson went from sleeping on cathedral steps to transforming lives across the country. From worthless to priceless. From invisible to unforgettable. Now I need to ask you something. After hearing this story, will you look at homeless people differently? Will you see the person behind the circumstances? Comment below and tell me how this story changed you. And please, if this story moved you, if it opened your heart, or changed your perspective, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like Marcus's need to be told, and your subscription helps us share more real transformations that prove no one is ever truly beyond hope. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worst day might be the beginning of their greatest purpose. Because sometimes, when someone tells you you're worthless, they're actually pointing you toward your worth. Thank you for listening to Marcus's story. Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for believing that everyone deserves to be seen. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next story that will restore your faith in humanity.